Welcome back, guys. So today we're looking at the third chapter of this media planning module, and it is to consider continuity schedules. So looking mainly at how advertising budget should be spread out across the time periods. So some of the other objectives that should be considered by media planners, you'll recall last time we looked at reach, frequency, and weight. This time we're looking at continuity, which is how the advertising budget should be allocated over time. Recency, so when the target audience should see your ad or have the opportunity to be exposed to your ad. And cost, so what is the most economically viable way to accomplish your objectives? That we will actually look at in the subsequent lecture, the final fourth chapter of the media planning module. So today we're looking mainly at continuity and recency. So the three exposure hypothesis, I mentioned this last time, was a heuristic or a rule of thumb that audiences should be exposed to your ad at least 3 times. So it's this sort of magic number of 3. As we mentioned before, most measurements of exposure are only based on the opportunity to see an ad, not the actual fact that they have seen your ad or been exposed to it, and definitely not the fact that they've engaged with your ad or have done whatever you've asked them to do. So that's always something to keep in the back of your mind, particularly if you're doing the media planning for your project or in the real world, that any measurement you see, those that are based on subscription rates or TV ratings or traffic, foot traffic in terms of billboards, those only ever tell you the number of people that might be exposed to your ad. It never ever tells you the number of people that actually see your ad or engage with your ad. The only forms of media that are able to reliably, I guess, track that is social media or digital media, where a click-through rate would, I guess, quite successfully indicate that someone has actually engaged with your ad. But apart from that, particularly with traditional media, all these measurements is just the potential to see your ad. So that's an important, I guess, message that I keep emphasizing. Advertisers usually aim for anywhere between 3 to 10 exposures during that 4-week, month-long schedule. The reason there is anything less than 3, based on this 3 exposure hypothesis, is insignificant. It doesn't work if it's less than 3 times, right? So this is based on the 3 exposure hypothesis. And on the extreme other hand, any more than 10 times, you start to get this decreased marginal utility. And so what that means is that you're just basically throwing money at something that, if it would have worked, a few exposures ago. So seeing anything more than 10 isn't really going to work in terms of convincing them. And you might notice that in your own life, where you don't remember seeing an ad because you probably haven't seen it more than 3 times. But on the other hand, if you've seen an ad more than 10 times, you start to experience that wear out, and maybe even in some cases you start to build resentment towards that brand. And so this 3 exposure hypothesis kind of aims to get an audience member to see or hear or be exposed to your ad in some way at least 3 times, but preferably no more than 10, because then you're starting to head into that wasted exposures territory. You want to consider using different multiple media if you're a believer of the 3 exposure hypothesis. And so in an earlier lecture we talked about audience fragmentation and how they're spread out across different media. And so the theory here is that if you use different media, then it increases the chance that you will expose an audience member to your ad at least 3 times. If you only ever use the one media, then you're putting all your eggs in that one basket, and a person may not be exposed to your ad the minimum 3 amount of times required. The previous example where we used that table from the textbook looking at crime, CSI, or crime scene investigation, as a TV show, if a media plan was to only use that as the single source of advertising placement, then you can see how it would fail to achieve its 3 exposure hypothesis, because there was one audience member in there that never watched that program, and so the exposure of that audience member is 0, right? And I think there was only one other person that might have been exposed 4 times because they're a regular viewer of CSI. But by using different media across a number of different platforms and channels, you increase the chance that a person is watching this particular TV program. One day they might see your ad, but then they're doing something else later, and you hit them with a similar ad in a magazine, and then they're browsing the internet, and then doing social media activity, and then they see the ad there again. And so you get the 3 exposures that way, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket. An opposite approach to the 3 exposure hypothesis is this other model called the shelf space model, or recency planning. And so this is an interesting idea where it's arguing that the consumer's first exposure to an ad is actually the most powerful. You might recall an earlier lecture when we talked about whether advertising was worth it or not in terms of an investment, and how to best invest in advertising. There was a decreasing marginal utility idea, and this is very much related to that. And it's saying that you get your biggest bang for buck from advertising spending in the first couple of dollars, and then everything after that is likely to be a waste. And the argument there is that advertising doesn't really convince people of anything that they weren't already sort of heading towards or thinking already, but it works very well as a nudge in the right direction if seen at the right time. So the primary role here of advertising then is not to hit them with the same idea over and over again, or at least a minimum of 3 times. No, the idea here is that they only need to see it once. But the thing is, they need to see it once at that window of opportunity. So in this case, if you believe in this model, then what you want to do is discount frequency and optimize reach, right? The argument being there is that you don't believe in the 3 exposure hypothesis, so that means you don't think consumers need to see your ad a minimum of 3 times. You believe that they only need to see your ad once, and so therefore you need to make sure as many of your target audience see your ad at least once. And the only way to make that work in terms of a limited budget is to discount frequency, right? So don't worry about hitting the same people over and over again. Worry about hitting everyone at least once. So how do you optimize weekly reach? Unless the brand is new, then the advertising might be a better tool for reminding and reinforcing rather than teaching. So this is this idea of recency planning. And so you want to make sure, as I mentioned before, that your brand is almost, at the top of mind all of the time, everywhere, because you aren't sure when the audience might be within that window of opportunity. But it doesn't matter when they see your ad, they just need to remember the brand at any given point, so that when they are about to purchase the product, your brand is top of mind. So ideally, these messages can be kind of remembered, or they could be exposed to these messages when they're close to this purchase time. And once again, it's building on that argument that the first exposure is greater than subsequent exposures. So if we use the example of Earth Initiative Sustainable Toilet Paper, which is one of the products of one of the brands we're working on in this particular paper as a project, toilet paper, you would argue, is something that people are buying all the time, right? And so it doesn't make sense to hit your target audience more than 3 times within that week, because if they're going to buy toilet paper, they're going to buy toilet paper. The only thing you need to make sure is that they remember your brand exists as an option in that window of opportunity when they're just about to buy toilet paper. And the only way you can, because you don't know when exactly people buy toilet paper, you want to spread out your advertising so that you can increase reach across the time period. You're not interested in hitting the same people over and over again. You just want to make sure you reach as many people as you can at least once during that time when they might be in the market for toilet paper. So you want to allocate the budget to reach more consumers, as explained. And you want to reach these target audience members continuously rather than sporadically. And so this will also feed into the subsequent slides on continuity or scheduling. So when we compare the 3 exposure hypothesis versus the recency planning model, there really is no sort of, I guess, right or wrong answer, and it often depends on the type of message you have. So that links back to the creative strategy lecture, but it also depends on the type of product that you're selling, right? And so, if we use the example of Earth Initiative toilet paper or Health by Habit supplements, then we can see how already using those two different products, you might have a different idea of which model of advertising works best for your particular brand. So the strong versus weak model of advertising really gets you to think about, whether advertising teaches consumers about a brand and influences their preference that way. So that means that advertising has a strong effect because you're essentially changing attitudes and potentially even changing behaviors. Or if you subscribe to a weak model of advertising, then what that suggests is that you believe that advertising merely just reminds and reinforces existing preferences and behavior. So behaviors that already exist to begin with, and all advertising is doing is just nudging at that right window of opportunity to make sure that people buy the product that you're trying to advertise. So that's a weak model of advertising. And advertising in that sense acts as a chance encounter with a ready consumer. So that's that window of opportunity. So in general, if you have a mature brand, so this is already a brand that people already know about, then you would argue that frequency doesn't matter as much. Right, so the 3 exposure hypothesis no longer matters because people already know about your brand. And so in that case, you're better to use your budget to optimize reach, to make sure that your brand maintains that top of mind presence. On the other hand, if it's a new brand, and this certainly is the case with actually all the brands that were working with Zuru on the group projects, all of those are new brands. And so unfortunately with new brands, because you're trying to create this positioning within the consumer's mind, you need both. You need reach and you need frequency because you're telling a new story in terms of how this product will fit into the life of your target audience. But at the same time, you need to reach a whole bunch of people to increase brand awareness to begin with, because nobody knows your brand exists. And even the people that are aware of your brand may not know the full story. And so reach and frequency, ironically, are required for new brands, which are the brands that usually have the least amount of budget because they're just starting out. Another thing to consider is how complex your message is. So this links back to the creative strategy. If you're telling a very complicated story, then you might need to tell it more often. And so then frequency needs to be emphasized. And so you have to be careful when you're thinking about the message you're delivering, not to overcomplicate it. Because when you overcomplicate it, that means you have to repeat it more often, which means you have to increase frequency. And it also means that the 3 exposure hypothesis, or that strong model of advertising, becomes more important, which inherently means you can't reach as many people, because as I mentioned before, you can't have massive reach and a lot of frequency. You have to make a trade-off between the two normally, and if you're trying to tell a complex message, then that means you need to repeat it more often, which means that your budget will need to be spent in a specific way to make sure that the people you do reach can see your ad at least 3 times or more. But in general, there are no hard or fast rules, right? So the tips above are just general observations and opinions. It once again ties back to the actual creative strategy, the creative component of the message that you've created. So scheduling is how the budget will be spread out across a time period. As I mentioned time and time again, that few advertisers can maintain a high level of ad spending the year round. Every company has a limited budget, even the multinationals such as Nike or Coca-Cola. And so what you want to do as a media planner is that you're trying to schedule it so that all your promotional efforts coincide with when you think your target audience is most likely going to want to buy your product. And this offers up a few, I guess, options for spreading out the budget. How should the media budget be distributed? Should it be concentrated initially, or should it be uniformly spread and allocated throughout the year? So this gives us 3 options. There's continuous schedule, the pulsing schedule, and a flighting schedule. The continuous schedule is when an advertising budget is allocated equally throughout the entire campaign. And this is great for consumption situations that are constant. So if we think about toilet paper, that's something that people pretty much buy on a weekly basis every time of the year. And so a continuous schedule makes sense for toilet paper, right? I guess the only exception to the rule is if it's you're launching a new brand of toilet paper, then it makes sense to have invested a little bit heavily at the beginning of the year or at the beginning of the campaign schedule, because you want to make sure people know about the toilet paper. And then as people find out more about it and what the story is actually about, you can taper off. But you never want to be in a position where you have zero budget allocated to advertising, because the window of opportunity for purchasing toilet paper is fairly constant throughout the year. The pulsing schedule is when you have a little bit of advertising throughout various parts of the year. So there's always a bit of spending, but then you pulse upwards, right? It never flatlines, hence the word pulsing. It's like the heartbeat, the pulse. There's always like something happening, but then it pulses upwards when there's more activity required, in this case of the advertising budget. So you're maintaining advertising throughout the year, but it pulses upwards during seasons of high consumption. So there might be something like health supplements, for example, where there's certain times of the year, in this case during the winter months perhaps, where people are feeling like they might get sick a little bit more, and so vitamin C or other supplements become a little bit more relevant to the population, and so then it becomes more important to be top of mind during those years, that time of the year. But on the other hand, you don't want to completely reduce the budget to zero, because there may be, for varying reasons, other people would still be interested in buying supplements even during the summer. Finally, the flighting schedule is when there are $0 in some parts of the year, and then you're using the funds to really boost advertising activity at those times of the year where the window of opportunity is widest in terms of purchasing your particular product or service. It's called flighting because, like a flight of a bird, it's on the ground, so there's nothing happening there, and then it takes off with a lot of energy. And so it's similar to continuous, but it's similar to pulsing, the only difference being that there is zero amount of money spent at certain times of the year. So think about what products that may be. Certainly, I don't think any of the products we're working with for the particular projects this year would amount to a flighting schedule, or would be recommended to adopt a flighting schedule, because toilet paper, health supplements, feminine hygiene products are all products that are purchased throughout the year. So you wouldn't want an occasion where there's zero advertising budget being spent. But have a think about what products you think might qualify for a flighting schedule. The one that comes to mind for me is something like soup. Right? Nobody, typically buys soup during the hotter months. It's a very uncommon purchase because warm soup is not that appealing during the summer months. However, during the winter months, it becomes very appealing. And so in that sense, you could think about applying a flighting schedule to products such as soup. In fact, if you think about the last time you saw a soup ad, I can almost guarantee you would not have seen one during the summer months. But heading into winter, you might start to see more advertising activity to do with soup, because that is when the window of opportunity exists for that particular product. So, putting it all together, here are some examples that are used in industry of how media planning works. So the first example you see there is just something you could even do on Excel. It's simply a Gantt chart, and there are various programs that are available. Those of you that end up working for a media agency, there will be platforms and tools and dashboards they already use, and they will teach you how to use those on the job. There's no point in us covering it because the technology changes so quickly, and the preferences of each agency is different, and so therefore it's more important you understand the basic concepts of the factors and criteria that should be considered by media planners, rather than how to use a particular dashboard or platform. But the basic concepts are the same throughout any agency, and that is thinking about time, thinking about money allocation, thinking about the vehicles and the media categories you would use, all with the intention of reaching as many of your target audience as possible and minimizing the amount of wasted exposure. So this example here, we see a number of different media categories selected. There's TV, there's radio, outdoor, there's online advertising, which is constant, and then there's a little bit of money for contingency, so things that might come up later in the campaign. This is a year-long schedule, but depending on what the client wants, that the time will obviously vary based on objectives. It could be a summer schedule only, it could be a year schedule, it could even be a multi-year schedule. With the, I guess, caveat in those cases that obviously the budget needs to be revisited more often if it's a longer time span. You see here that they've gone for a combination of activity, and because there is year-round spending in terms of online, this is not a flighting schedule. It looks to me like it is a pulsing schedule because there's constant activity throughout the year, mainly with online, but then the energy or the advertising activity pulses upwards during the months of February to May, and then August through to December. Right, and so you've got a lot of activity happening twice a year. I don't know what the product is, but you can see how that activity can be tracked and planned out. And so this is what the media planner does. So for those of you that like that sort of tactical aspect of and the strategizing of where to use different tools and how to use different vehicles in different media categories, and then how to spend the money in the best way possible to achieve the outcomes that you and your business partners have decided on, then media planning is really something that you might want to look into. This example here is a more, I guess, industry-based platform. You notice the dashboard is very similar to like Outlook or other tools that we're already familiar with, and so it's a bit more specific in terms of the technicalities of how things are rolled out and how they're spent and how they are tracked. But as I mentioned before, it doesn't really matter whether you do know or don't know how to use a specific platform, as long as the concepts always remain at the top of your mind when you consider allocating budget to a media plan. And so you always want to think about how much money you have, how much things are going to cost, when the best time to spend that money is, depending on the type of product or service you're advertising, where the best places to spend that money is in terms of reaching your target audience, right? And so those sorts of concepts, which hopefully we've covered now, are the ones that matter in terms of the idea of media planning. Right, next time we're going to look at cost efficiency, and then we're going to segue into cost effectiveness. So the two things sound the same, but they're actually quite different. And to understand what the difference is and how they roll out, then we also need to look at the methods of making each exposure more effective. And then in that lecture, I will link back to some of the creative concepts that we covered in preceding lectures. See you guys next time.